On April 21st, in the New York Times, the paper reported that somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people had already been killed in the genocide. It was in the paper, not on the front page. It was a lot like the Holocaust coverage. It was buried in the paper. Rwanda itself was not seen as newsworthy, and amazingly, genocide itself was not seen as newsworthy. But on April 21st, a wonderfully honest moment occurred, and that was that an American congresswoman named Patricia Schroeder from Colorado met with a group of journalists, and one of the journalists said to her, "What's up? What's going on in the U.S. government? 200,000 to 300,000 people have just been exterminated in the last couple of weeks in Rwanda." It's 2 weeks into the genocide at that time, but of course at that time you don't know how long it's going to last. And the journalist said, "Why is there so little response out of Washington? Why no hearings, no denunciations, no people getting arrested in front of the Rwandan embassy or in front of the White House? What's the deal?" And she said, she was so honest, and she said, "It's a great question. All I can tell you is that in my congressional office in Colorado and my office in Washington, we're getting hundreds and hundreds of calls about the endangered ape and gorilla population in Rwanda, but nobody is calling about the people. The phones just aren't ringing about the people." And the reason I give you this moment is there's a deep truth in it. And that truth is, or was, in the 20th century, that while were beginning to develop endangered species movements, we didn't have an endangered peoples movement. We had Holocaust education in the schools. Most of us were groomed not only on images of nuclear catastrophe, but also on images and knowledge of the Holocaust. There's a museum, of course, on the Mall in Washington, right next to Lincoln and Jefferson. Almost out of nowhere, there has come into being an anti-genocide movement, an anti-genocide constituency, and one that looks destined, in fact, to be permanent. It grew up in response to the atrocities in Darfur. It is comprised of students. There are something like 300 anti-genocide chapters on college campuses around the country. Evangelicals have joined it. Jewish groups have joined it. Hotel Rwanda watchers have joined it. It is a cacophonous movement. To call it a movement, as with all movements perhaps, is a little misleading. It's diverse. It's got a lot of different approaches. It's got all the ups and the downs of movements. It sees itself, such as it is, as something that will create the impression that there will be political costs, there will be a political price to be paid for allowing genocide, for not having a heroic imagination, for not being an upstander, but for being, in fact, a bystander. Now, because it's student-driven, there's some amazing things that the movement has done. They have launched a divestment campaign that has now convinced, I think, 55 universities in 22 states to divest their holdings of stocks with regard to companies doing business in Sudan. They have a 1-800-genocide number. This is going to sound very kitsch. But for those of you who may not be, maybe apolitical, but interested in doing something about genocide, you dial 1-800-genocide and you type in your zip code, and you don't even have to know who your congressperson is. It will refer you directly to your congressperson, to your U.S. senator, to your governor, where divestment legislation is pending. They've lowered the transaction costs of stopping genocide. I think the most innovative thing they've introduced recently are genocide grades, and it takes students to introduce genocide grades. So what you now have when the Congress is in session is members of Congress calling up these 19-year-olds or 24-year-olds and saying, "I'm just told I have a D- on genocide. What do I do to get a C? I just want to get a C. Help me." Now, what this movement has done is it has extracted from the Bush administration, from the United States, at a time of massive overstretch, military, financial, diplomatic, a whole series of commitments to Darfur that no other country in the world is making. The bad news, however, to this question of will evil prevail, is that evil lives on. The people in those camps are surrounded on all sides by so-called Janjaweed, these men on horseback with spears and Kalashnikovs, women who go to get firewood in order to heat the humanitarian aid, in order to feed their families. Humanitarian aid, the dirty secret of it is it has to be heated, really, to be edible. And the peacekeepers I mentioned, the force has been authorized, but almost no country on earth has stepped forward since the authorization to actually put its troops or its police in harm's way. So we have achieved an awful lot relative to the 20th century, and yet far too little relative to the gravity of the crime that is unfolding as we sit here, as we speak. And the Holocaust culture that we have in this country makes Americans sort of more prone to, I think, want to bring Never Again to life. At this time in particular in America's history, we have a credibility problem, a legitimacy problem in international institutions. It is structurally really, really hard to do, as the Bush administration rightly does, which is to denounce genocide on a Monday and then describe waterboarding on a Tuesday as a no-brainer, and then turn up on Wednesday and look for troop commitments. But it is essential for us to be a leader in this sphere, of course, to restore our standing and our leadership in the world. We have to ask ourselves, what now? What do we do going forward as a country and as citizens in relationship to the world's worst places, the world's worst suffering, killers, and the kinds of killers that could come home to roost sometime in the future? We have reason to be afraid of melting ice caps. We have reason to be afraid that we haven't secured loose nuclear material in the former Soviet Union. Let's focus on what are the legitimate challenges and threats, but not lunge into bad decisions because of a panic, of a fear. In times of fear, one of the things Sergey used to say is fear is a bad advisor. We lunge toward the extremes when we aren't operating and trying to, again, calibrate our relationship to the world around us.